actually got involved in tax policy under Calvin Coolidge. Jerry Scheib of the Wall Street Journal, the bureau chief, said I've been involved in tax policy since I was 14 years old, and so I went back to my chair and did the mathematics, which means I was involved since 1954 when the tax code started. I do want to say thank Heritage for hosting it. Heritage has been in the forefront of tax reform for many years, and quite frankly, I'm privileged, I think, to be in the same room with Steve Enton, who played such an important role, Evan Lidier, who did, also on the Hill, and I cannot say enough about Richard Rahn. He was a leader of the supply side movement. He was involved in every tax debate. Everything I did right is because of what Richard taught me. Everything that I do wrong is because I didn't listen. Steve Moore, without Steve Moore, I don't think you would have had the Reagan Revolution.
I wasn't even here yet.
And he wasn't even here there, so you can see his great influence. And then we're talking about Dan Mitchell, too. So having said that, maybe what I could add is the lessons learned from past tax reform, and less of the economics, but more the politics. Why did we have a Tax Reform Act? Why do we have tax reform in 1978? Why did we have tax reform in 1981? Why in 86? Why, after Camp did all that great work last year, why didn't we have it last year? And why will it take place in? And I will perhaps tell you what that date is, depending how the discussion goes. So let's address those issues, and I've come up with my own list of 6 elements that contribute to tax reform happening, and those could be good or bad tax reform. And let me briefly go through those. Dan referred to George Santayana, and I would like to add to that and say those who have not learned from past tax reforms are doomed to pay for future ones. So remember that if you don't learn the lessons from this panel. What is the first lesson? It's not an overnight momentum. These things build. In other words, you can't show up, for those of you who work on the Hill, and get your member to introduce a bill and think you're going to have tax reform. It's a wave. It's an overall pent-up demand for tax reform. And throughout my comments, I'm going to talk about 78, which was the capital gains tax cut, 81, the first Reagan, 86, the Tax Reform Act, and of course the one that will arrive when I may let you know what that date is. So if we talk about the overnight, it's not an overnight phenomenon. What happened in 78? You had built-up inflation. As Richard said, you were paying taxes on inflationary gains. You had stagflation under Jimmy Carter. You had a peculiar political event in Silicon Valley. They were unable to get venture capital for Silicon Valley startups. And you had this malaise, similar to the one we have now. And one of the peculiar things, or one of the reasons this thing took off, is this entrepreneur actually came to Washington and said, I have to sell all my companies to the Japanese because I can't raise enough venture capital. So there was a built-up malaise, built-up economic problems, and that is something that was a predicate for the Tax Reform Act of 78. If you go further and you look at 86, which was a tax reform act, what were some of the things that were built up? First of all, you had widespread discontent with the tax code. The rich folks were getting away with murder. Democrats were concerned because there were so many loopholes. Republicans were upset, especially supply-sider, because we needed to have lower tax rates. And the Kemp-Roth movement didn't appear overnight. Again, it's not an overnight phenomenon, but you need this pent-up demand to trigger tax reform. What's the second lesson that one can learn about past and future tax reforms? You need a trigger. You need something to ignite the flame for tax reform. Well, let's look at 3 types of triggers. Leadership. Sometimes leadership is a lack of leadership. Under Jimmy Carter, you had a president who really wasn't doing much. He became sort of irrelevant. And so there was a vacuum in leadership. And so you had the pent-up demand, and you had the supply-side movement, you had the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, and you had individuals who can make a difference, like many of these at the table here. Then you've got a different type of leadership. Ronald Reagan in 81. He built on what had been going on for years, the supply-side movement. He ran on it in his campaign. And that's an example of leadership, which you don't have many Ronald Reagans on the left or right here today. Another example of leadership, which is lacking now, you had leadership, bipartisan leadership. You had Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, working with a war dealer from Chicago, Rostenkowski, the Democratic chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and you had an interesting person in the United States Senate by the name of Bob Packwood, who was a Republican, and they all wanted to do tax reform. Again, the trigger leadership. Another type of trigger is a vehicle. One that didn't work was the idea of a grand bargain that was going to help take advantage of the pent-up demand. Remember, that was supposed to happen last year. It did not. Another type of vehicle is hopefully not a severe economic crisis. In 2008, the whole thing collapsed, and basically the administration went up to the Hill and said, we've got to do something. They did the wrong thing, but I suspect if something like that happened again, you just grab for whatever you think might happen. It could help. And then finally, today in the paper, there are stories about if Senator McConnell becomes the majority leader, what will he do? And he was talking about tying in tax extenders, and we always talk about the debt ceiling being a way to force tax reform. So the three types of triggers, again, could be leadership, a vehicle, or a crisis. The third element that I think we should look at, Richard alluded to, and this is peculiar to tax policy, but it is critical to determine whether or not we get tax reform, and that's this concept called tax expenditures. And very, very simply, we have an income tax in the United States. There's a fellow by the name of Stanley Surrey who said that should be the departure point for any tax reform. If you have an income tax, something like a lower capital gains tax or an IRA is considered a loophole because it is a departure of taxing everything. Now that makes it very, very hard for people at this table to argue for economic growth incentives because they are tax expenditures or tax loopholes. And that is something which Evan and Steve and all of us here know that has constrained our ability to do tax reform for many, many years. Now the interesting thing about tax expenditures, in other words, focusing on loopholes or focusing on fairness, sometimes growth triumphs that. That is to say, we were able to reduce the capital gains tax in '78 because people were more concerned about growth, about the Silicon Valley fellow who couldn't get money for startups. And again, that was the Reagan philosophy, growth. So growth in that time was a way to sort of get over the concern about fairness, which is what a lot of these tax expenditures are about. The fourth element that could make or not make tax reform, and that's dynamic scoring. As Richard pointed out, that is always a constraint because if you have a tax cut that encourages growth, the government won't recognize it. And as Richard has pointed out, when we've had capital gains tax cuts in '78, after '78, we had revenues go up because of a technical concept that calls unlocking. You no longer want to hold, if you have a capital gains, you can determine when it's paid because it's a question about whether you take the capital gains tax, but more importantly because of the economic impact of lower capital gains, tax cuts on entrepreneurship and the economy in whole. So whenever we've had lower capital gains taxes, we've had economic growth and more revenue to the Treasury. There's an interesting anecdote about dynamic scoring, which I think will be relevant also for the future. And that is when Richard led the effort in 1978 to reduce capital gains tax, I don't know how many of you people work on the Hill, but there's an office called the Joint Committee on Taxation, which scores determines how much capital tax cuts or tax increases, what the impact will be on revenue. But it's static. It's not dynamic. It doesn't look at what happens in the real world. So this is what always happens. So Richard came up with a good idea. Why don't we introduce econometric models? And so they're sitting there, and the Joint Committee on Taxation says if you reduce capital gains tax, it's going to cost all this revenue. And the members of Congress, if you work for members of Congress, they hate the bureaucrats in Congress, you know, who constrain them. All of a sudden, Richard shows up with this econometric model that says, look at the dynamic impact. And they applaud whether or not they're for or against lower capital gains taxes because somebody took on these bureaucrats in Congress. So then the people in Congress opposing capital gains criticized our first econometric model, and while they were criticizing that, we came up with another one, and another one. And Bob Samuelson, the journalist, came up with the phrase, have model will travel. So the point being is dynamic scoring is something that's out there, and thank goodness Paul Ryan, is going to make dynamic scoring one of his top priorities. What is the fifth one? The fifth one is one of my favorites, being more of a lobbyist than an economist, although I probably am not successful either. And that is what Bismarck once said. And remember, Richard goes back to Calvin Coolidge, but Ron was also a good friend of Otto von Bismarck, the former chancellor of Germany, who very once said, tax law and sausages are two things you do not want to be seen made. And that's a reality if you look at the tax legislative process. And there are a couple of interesting, this is a dynamic which one has to understand as you get involved in tax reform. You have to be able to use that. There are all sorts of interesting anecdotes about that. Senator Moynihan, the distinguished Harvard professor, who was born in Oklahoma but talked like an English Don, one day at a Senate Finance Committee markup, was startled to see that we were going to make tax increases retroactive. And he said, that is un-American. How can this happen? And the reality is you can do whatever you want. Russell Long said of the majority of the committee. So if you talk about tax, you worry about things like that. You worry about encouraging certain members of Congress to go along with an amendment and they get a carve-out for themselves. Or you worry about silos. If you're going to increase taxes for the business, you have to pay for it. In fact, there's a former congressman named Frank Guarini of New Jersey, who always had to pay for it. And the problem is when he had to pay for his favorite tax reform measure, somebody would steal it, and that's called being Frank Guarini. So if you talk about, when you get into the process of tax reform, that's something you need to worry about. Now I have one final point that you ought to look at. Remember I said tax reform is not an overnight phenomenon. But there is another phenomenon, and that is a pitcher of beer can bring about big things. And as our friend over here who worked for Senator Packwood pointed out, in 1986, when you had the 86 tax reform coming, it always died, it always came back, and Senator Packwood had a pitcher of beer once at a local place on the Senate side, and lo and behold, he resurrected tax reform, and it became a reality. Now, having said that, I said I would tell you what's going to happen next. How many of you people heard of Jerry Scheib? Hey, okay, he's the Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal. How many people have heard of Al Hunt? Al Hunt, okay, as you know, he's been a pundit for many years. And how many people think anything I say today makes any sense? Okay, nobody. Okay, having said that, here's what I think will happen next. Jerry Scheib predicted that you really do get legislation passed with a president of one party and a Congress of another. And this is an assertion he made in a recent column. And then the Washington Post, I'm not talking about whether you agree with him or not, did the research, and they found out if you look at major pieces of legislation being passed, they were passed with divided government. Whether that's going to happen or not, we'll see. The second thing is Al Hunt. And this is something Richard alluded to. Al Hunt wrote a piece earlier this year, said tax reform through the income tax is no longer possible. That is to say, the loopholes, the preferences are so entrenched that you won't be able to fix the income tax. I believe that, and I think therefore you may go to another type of tax, not just an income tax. And I think that opens all sorts of opportunities. And finally, I believe that sooner or later you're going to have a consumed income tax, which is not a value-added tax, for two reasons. Number one, it is a way to deal with the problems of eliminating preferences because you're trying something new because you couldn't fix the income tax. And so you're trying something new by eliminating saving and investment. You can deal with progressivity. You can deal with all these type of problems. So I think politically it's very intriguing. And then finally, I think economically it is the way to go for greater economic growth. So thank you very much.
Economic output.
May I comment on Democrats, Piketty,
Yeah, sure.
and Janet Yellen?
Go for it.
Okay. With regard to Steve's point about bipartisanship, I think if you deal with very big issues in this country, you need bipartisanship for it to really work or for it to get enacted into law. Now, the question that Steve raises is very legitimate and very profound, and that is the Democratic Party has changed and the Republican Party has changed. And the question is, are there going to be any Bill Bradleys? Are there going to be Dick Gephardts, who united with supply-siders to bring about the 86 tax reform? And there were good things that Bill Bradley and Dick Gephardt did, and that is they favored lower rates. But the concern I have is they also paid for those lower rates with tax increases on saving and investment. So the question is, are there any Democrats out there? And I'm looking for Democrats, and they're hard to find at times, who are willing to look at the base, as you pointed out, and not only the rates. And there are some interesting things that Ron Wyden, for example, is saying. One of the things about Ron Wyden, they had a joint hearing on capital gains. And Dave Brockway, who was one of the architects of 86, is you cannot have a tax reform without taxing capital gains as ordinary income. Can't be done. Brockway. And the next thing that happens is Ron Wyden says, well, wait a minute. What we probably could do, taking into account this and that, we could have an exclusion, which would deal with the concern about capital, and we can have a progressive exclusion, which Richard and I knew is exactly what Senator Russell Long suggested doing, so it affects all income groups. And this is the whole question about different actors, different times, and different tax reform. So it's obviously difficult, but I think there are some folks out there who are willing to jump in. That's on Democrats. With regard to Thomas Piketty, I am consumed with Thomas Piketty. I have Thomas Piketty in French. I have Thomas Piketty in English. And are there any Turks out here? Turkey just published Thomas Piketty in Turkish. Now, why do I think it's interesting? I think there are several things. Yes, he's been discredited among academia, but he still pops up. He provides a lot of the intellectual argument for people who want.
Bill Gates was just quoting.
Yes, and Janet Yellen footnoted him, and the book, as you pointed out, there's also, whenever his name appears, comments about Thomas Piketty increase in Congress. So he's somebody who needs to be addressed, and I think what is incumbent is that it not be a right-center debate about Thomas Piketty, it be a centrist debate about Thomas Piketty. There are two interesting polls that just came out. Richard is right, polls are polls. But one indicated, do you believe in the American dream? And the answer was 6 out of 10 people no longer believe in the American dream as they define it. The second question is, those same 60% indicated they favor economic growth over economic fairness. So that American psyche still exists. And I think it very incumbent then for a centrist response to Piketty, because inequality is not going to go away. Now, Janet Yellen is very interesting, because here's a continuation about the debate. And so my plea is that this is a debate that people who think he's been rebutted, I hope will still stay in debate, and it has to be a debate from the center. And as an example, as you know, Steve, there's a congressman by the name of Jared Polis. Now, for those of you who are very, very good, you're probably not as good as Jared Polis. He's entered college with zero money and left 4 years later with $100 million. Why? Because he did 2 internet startups. And somebody like Jared Polis in the past has spoken out for economic growth over fairness.
Okay. Stephen?